Practice guidelines for nutrition in critically ill patients. I really look for Indian scenarios. So the reason why we came out with this guideline is there were no Indian guidelines addressing the nutritional goals in intensive care patients, and this we published in IJCCM in year 2018. And as you can see, the authors, I think even I'm one of the author for creating this guideline. So we had multiple meetings supported by ABOT, and we formulated this guideline. So why is it important that we need to have the Indian guidelines? So we'll just look into the background of nutrition in intensive care. So I think in any ICU patients, so there is element of immune dysfunction, and there is an ongoing muscle weakness and wasting that overrides some of the medical problems that patient may be admitted with. And there is increasing GI tolerance that is very distinctly seen in intensive care patients, and all this together leads to a ventilatory dependence, because each one of these variables, immune dysfunction, muscle wasting and GI intolerance, has a bearing on ventilatory duration and dependence and difficulty in weaning. And there are other distinct problems seen in intensive care patients like aspiration, and you have gastroesophageal reflux which leads to aspiration. So all this increases the morbidity of patients in intensive care, and this may further compound the problem by causing sepsis and multi-organ dysfunction. These are the elements that remain on the background, which have profound impact on the nutritional status of the patients, and nutritional impact having a bearing on the morbidity and mortality of the patients in intensive care. So why do we think the guidelines is important, and what are the elements or the variables that we have addressed in the guidelines? So the one thing we needed to address is obviously the timing of enteral nutrition. So all of you would agree there is absolutely no debate at this point of time that every patient in intensive care should be fed unless otherwise there is an absolute contraindication, and that is a quality indicator. So we look, and that remains true even for our Indian patients. And we need to have some understanding as to why these intensive care patients need to be fed, and the route of nutrition. So, which is the ideal route of nutrition, and which are all the patients that need to be fed. So, for me, the answer would be all patients should be fed unless otherwise there's absolute contraindication. And what about the composition of the diet? I think that also becomes important, and what type of feeds that need to be given, and ideal composition. So these are some of the things that we need to address in the guidelines. As you see, I think there are guidelines literally present from every country. So US has guidelines, which is Aspen. Europeans come with European guidelines, and there is a Canadian critical care nutrition guidelines. But Indian Intensive Care Society, being the big society with close to 10,000 members, I think it was considered important that we do come out with our own guidelines. So if we look at the grading of the evidence, I think it is a universally sort of accepted sort of a approach to the guideline formulation. So any level A would be strong recommendation. So level B would be moderate recommendation. Level C would be weak recommendation. So, and for this, against each of these recommendations, there is level of evidence that would be cited. So the first level one would be from the internationally accepted guidelines. Level two would be from good meta-analysis or randomized controlled trials, and level three would be uh, from controlled trials and prospective cohort studies. So on and so forth. So this is how we try to weigh the evidence to each statement that is being given in this guideline. So what we would be looking at nutrition assessment, nutrition practices, and whether there is any role of disease specific nutrition, like is there any role for specific nutrition goals for kidney injury or for liver patients, documentation practices, and we look into monitoring tolerance and adequacy. So if you look at the guidelines, so I think these are some of the initial guidelines that have been laid out in our Indian guidelines. So the nutritional status of a malnourished patient or an Indian ICU patient should be assessed by subjective global assessment. So this we agreed as a reasonable tool to assess the nutritional status of ICU patients, and that gets moderate recommendation with with moderate level of evidence, level 3 evidence. And initial monitoring of nutrition for every ICU patient should be done on a daily basis by a dietitian, and nutrition plan should be modified accordingly. That gets strong recommendation, and level of evidence is one. And as you see, it is very important and imperative that nutrition assessment is done by a dietitian or a well qualified and trained nutritionist, and who is dedicated to ICU. So if you are running a, say, 15 or 20 bed ICU, it is expected that you have a nutritionist or a dietitian dedicated to that place, so that our nutritional optimization is very effective, and that gets strong recommendation, and level of evidence is one. And we have also elucidated the nutritionist to patient ratio. So it is desirable that nutritionist to critically ill patient ratio be maintained at 1 is to 25. So for every 25 patients, it is expected there is one dietitian or a one nutritionist. So this is something which you could consider in as a case-based example. So wherever feasible, you could use computed tomography or ultrasound to assess the lean body mass. That gets moderate recommendation, and level of evidence is 5. So it's not a strong level of evidence. So these are some of the guidelines that has been put at the outset. So, what about the timing of nutrition and the importance and indications of critical ill? So, as I have reiterated, every intensive care patient should be fed enterally within 24 to 48 hours of admission. And I'm sure every listener would agree there's absolutely no debate or dispute on this. And in fact, this is a quality indicator or a quality benchmark. So, if we are not feeding any of our ICU patients, it tantamounts to breach of our quality indicator. And at the same time, as we initiate the nutrition, it is a onerous responsibility of every intensivist to assess the nutritional status, to look for any features of cachexia, edema, or atrophy. And uh, and if you are not able to achieve 50 to 60% of the target nutrition within 72 hours by oral feeding, then enteral nutrition by tube feeding has to be initiated. And if you are not able to achieve the targets up to 7 days, and if you're not able to initiate enteral nutrition, then parenteral nutrition could be considered, and it has to be taken up as to case basis. So, what about the feeding practices in hemodynamically unstable? I think this is something which we should upload our Indian guidelines, because no guideline really puts emphasis on hemodynamically unstable patients. So, we thought we should address this, because in intensive care we would be dealing with hemodynamically unstable patients more often. So, the recommendation is, if patient is hemodynamically unstable, I think our whole resolve and intent is to stabilize them hemodynamically with fluid resuscitation and initiation of vasopressors, and try to stabilize him before we start enteral nutrition. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is one. And as we do this, because they have been hemodynamically unstable, we need to monitor for gut function, whether gut is functional, so that the enteral nutrition could be initiated, or whether there is a gut dysfunction or gut intolerance, then obviously the feeding initiation may get delayed. And once the patient is stabilized, and is stabilized on reasonable level of vasopressors, or decreasing trend of vasopressor need, then enteral nutrition should be initiated within 24 to 48 hours. So your initial recommendation is you stabilize them with fluid resuscitation and vasopressors. And if the trends of vasopressor need is coming down and it is not increasing, then you know for sure enteral nutrition can be initiated within 24 to 48 hours. But despite your fluid resuscitation, despite your vasopressor need, if patient is in persistent shock and there is a escalating need for the vasopressors, then obviously your gut will be dysfunctional. So there's no point initiating enteral nutrition, and that may be a situation where we may have to hold on to the enteral nutrition. So what about route of enteral nutrition? There is absolutely no debate on this. So we know that we are all too much obsessed with our enteral nutrition, and that's the evidence at this point of time. So enteral nutrition is the preferred route of therapy. Strong recommendation and level of evidence is one. And if only enteral nutrition cannot be initiated up to 7 days for various reasons, then only parenteral nutrition could be considered. I know there has been a recent data on combining enteral nutrition along with parenteral nutrition as achieving our caloric targets, but that is not routinely recommended as per our Indian guidelines, and it gets a strong recommendation and level of evidence is 2. What about tube feeding? I think with regards to enteral nutrition, if you are not able to achieve adequate calorie targets with oral feeding, tube feeding to be initiated by inserting a nasogastric tube. I think 8 to 12 French tubes is what is recommended. And in tube feeding, your commercially available formula feeding is what is recommended. So you have preformed bags of this nature which could be considered, and generally continuous infusion is what is recommended as opposed to bolus. So as of now there are ready to hang commercially available formula feeds that are available, that gets moderate recommendation with reasonable amount of evidence for the same. So there is a strong recommendation against the use of blenderized diet, because of, I think internationally most guidelines do not recommend the use of blenderized or kitchen diet because of increasing risk of infection and because of hygiene issues that may be involved with regards to storage and handling of the blenderized diet. That gets moderate recommendation with some amount of evidence. So what about estimating energy and protein requirement? So our Indian guidelines do suggest the protein target should be 1.2 to 2 grams per kg per day. Strong recommendation with the level of evidence is level 1. So I think there's a lot of renewed emphasis on cranking up or increase protein delivery. I think that remains the norm at this point of time. Try to target higher protein delivery. So the calorie loading or calorie target is 25 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day is the recommendation from Indian guidelines. But if you have a patient who is severely hypercatabolic, like maybe severe sepsis or severe burns or traumatic brain injury in a young patient, so in a special situation, typically in burn patients, the kilocalories is to nitrogen ratio should be 120 is to 1. So that is the recommendation. But if you are dealing with a specialized cases like burns, then your calorie intake or your calorie target should be based out of the by should be guided by this Toronto formula. So that is about your energy requirements. 25 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day is the guideline suggestion, and protein is 1.2 to 2.2 1.2 to 2 grams per kg per day is what the protein recommendation is. And what about permissible underfeeding? I know there are some recent literature on underfeeding trying to have a favorable effect on the outcome. So intentional underfeeding has to be considered only in specific indication, not as a norm and not as a routine ICU feed. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So routine underfeeding is not recommended. It's only reserved for specific indication. So if you have obese patients, you're dealing with obese patients, underfeeding could be considered. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So what about the type of enteral feeding that we should be considering? I think universally all the guidelines along with our Indian guidelines, we do suggest to use standard polymeric formula feeds. That get strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. The main reason why we suggest and recommend standard polymeric feed formula feeds is there is no inconsistency in the calories and in the proteins and in the carbohydrate nutritional goals that we achieve with this. There is no heterogeneity in the type of nutrition we provide, and I think our ability to maintain homogeneity in the nutritional targets that we would achieve would be much better with polymeric formula feeds. And what about specialized formula feeds? Specialty formula feeds is something which you have a specified feeds that are defined for kidney patients or liver failure patients. So specialty formula feeds is not routinely recommended for all our ICU patients. So you may consider it as case to case example. So as of now, there is no strong recommendation for using specialty formula feeds as a routine in intensive care. So what about micronutrients? So if patient is being fed on is being fed on commercially available formula feeds, there is no need to supplement micronutrients, vitamins, or trace elements, because all these are present in the commercially available formula feeds that we give. You don't need to supplement it from outside. But on the other hand, if you are feeding the patient with your blenderized diet with the kitchen feeds or TPN, then micronutrients may have to be supplemented. So, or in a special situations where there is pre-existing micronutrient deficiency, that needs to be evaluated if any of these patients have current currently prevailing micronutrient deficiency, and assessment needs to be made, and then supplementation to be considered. That gets moderate recommendation and weak level of evidence. What about immune enhancing enteral nutrition? So immune modulating nutrients could be considered for patients with traumatic brain injury, or in patients who have undergone major surgical procedures as per the Indian guidelines. But I think my personal suggestion is, I think there is no strong evidence for it. So I think I would suggest the listeners to exercise their discretion while using immunomodulating agents in these situations. And as you see, immune modulating nutrients are not routinely used. Strong recommendation level of evidence, and the suggestion is made in guidelines that you could give it for traumatic brain injury major surgery. That also, my suggestion would be to exercise discretion on case based sort of a approach. And I think the recommendation is in a patient where you are not achieving more than 700 ml per day of enteral nutrition, you are struggling to achieve, then there is no role for giving immunonutrients, and that gets strong recommendation level of evidence is one. So in patients where your enteral targets are not achieving even 700 ml per day, no point in supplementing immunonutrients. And what about the role of glutamine in multi-organ dysfunction? There is no recommendation for use of glutamine in patients with multi-organ dysfunction. That gets moderate recommendation and level of evidence is 5. What about patients with hepatic failure? In patients with liver failure, enteral nutrition is what is recommended as a strong recommendation. Level of evidence is 1, both in acute liver failure and chronic liver failure. And in liver failure, obviously, when they have decompensated, they have lot of fluid accumulation, ascites. So sodium restriction could be considered, moderate recommendation with weak level of evidence. What about role of branched chain amino acids in liver failure patients? There is no recommendation, no benefit for routine use of branched chain amino acids. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. What about calories in liver failure? The suggested calories in liver failure is in fact more than the normal. So normally we suggested 25 to 30. So in liver failure, they may need more calories, 35 to 40 kilocalories per kg per day is what is recommended. And what I want to emphasize is this protein, because in earlier days we had this notion that in liver failure we should restrict the protein intake to prevent them from going into hepatic encephalopathy. Now we have realized that it's a myth. So the suggestion is we have to give normal protein to your liver failure, which is 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kg per day, which is a strong recommendation, and level of evidence is 1. And protein restriction in fact should be avoided, and it could be only considered only in a very refractory encephalopathy, which is a moderate recommendation and weak level of evidence. And protein supplementation in liver failure, we should take the dry weight of the patient, because most of liver failure will have a lot of fluid sequestration. So dry weight or usual weight is what should be considered. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So protein supplementation to be guided by the dry weight of the patient. So what about nutrition in traumatic brain injury? In traumatic brain injury, enteral nutrition should be considered within 24 to 48 hours after hemodynamic stability is achieved. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. And as you see in Indian guidelines, there is recommendation of using arginine or eicosapentaenoic acid or docosapentaenoic acid as a supplement along with enteral nutrition. But I think again my personal suggestion is exercise discretion on routine usage of these agents, as immunomodulators in traumatic brain injury, although our Indian guidelines do give strong recommendation with level of evidence 1. So my personal suggestion is to exercise your discretion. And the protein intake for traumatic brain injury again is 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kg per day. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. What about in respiratory failure patients? So in respiratory failure patients like COPD, there is a strong recommendation for using calorie dense central nutrition. So normally we use 1 kilocalories per ml. So here you may want to consider 2 kilocalories per ml. So that is something what we call as calorie dense central nutrition should be considered. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. But I think there has been a myth saying that in type 2 respiratory failure, limiting the use of carbohydrate enriched diet may improve the outcomes or may reduce the carbon dioxide retention, but that has been found to be myth, because we find no difference between low carbohydrate increased fat as opposed to standard enteral feeding with increased protein content, and that gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So there's no difference between mitigating or curtailing the carbohydrate intake vis-a-vis a standard carbohydrate intake. So the suggestion is to increase their protein intake, and standard feeds is what is recommended. Not more carbohydrate or less carbohydrate. Normal recommended carbohydrate is what is suggested. So, and as you see, even there is recommendation against the use of low carbohydrate and increased fat. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So in respiratory failure or COPD, small frequent feeds is found to improve the compliance. So that has been given strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So in respiratory failure or type 2 failure, so normal standard enteral nutrition with good protein intake and no need to curtail carbohydrate intake, and maybe calorie rich feeds may be useful. So 2 kilocalories per ml or more can be considered, and small allocates of feeds may improve the compliance in respiratory failure. What about in acute kidney injury? In acute kidney injury also, the recommendation is to give standard enteral formula. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. Again, as it is in liver failure, even in acute kidney injury, there is no need to restrict protein, because earlier we used to have this notion that in acute kidney injury who are not on dialysis, protein restriction has to be made, but patients who are on dialysis, you have to increase the protein. But that now has become a myth. Even in acute kidney injury, there is no need to restrict protein. Strong recommendation, and your protein suggestion is always minimum in liver failure or standard enteral nutrition, or in acute kidney injury the minimal protein intake should be 1.2, and you can crank it up slowly up to 1.7 to 1.22 grams per kg per day, and that gets a level of recommendation as C. And in patients who have significant electrolyte abnormality, like if they have hyperkalemia, obviously you may want to curtail your potassium intake, or if you have hypernatremia, you may want to curtail sodium intake. So these are some of the modifications that could be done, and that gets strong recommendation, and level of evidence is 1. So now we have looked at the whole indication for feeding, the timing of feeding, the constituents of the feeding, the protein intake in different disease condition, the calorie intake in different disease condition. Then we have looked at so we have looked at immunonutrients as and what is the evidence for it and the guideline suggestion. So having done all that, we need to have a standard operating process as to having good protocols whilst implementing these nutritional practices. So the checking of the weight and assessing nutritional status has to be done on a weekly basis. There needs to be a weekly review by a dietitian of the body weight, and whether there has been an ongoing weight gain or weight loss, and whether there has been any favorable progress in their nutritional status. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 2. And the screening and assessment tools has to be kept as a protocol. So you need to have these tools kept as a standard operating process whilst assessing nutritional status in intensive care. And nutritional diagnosis and care plan has to be made on a daily basis by a nutritionist or a dietitian, and any complications that may be arising with enteral nutrition should be documented be it with regards to infection or ongoing diarrhea. So all this has to be documented, charted down, and the suitable steps that has been taken to curtail this has to be documented. So it's all about, this whole slide is all about documenting the nutrition practices that is happening in your ICU, and executing in a protocolized way is what is emphasized. So what about monitoring tolerance and adequacy? So checking for gastric residual volume, although there is recent evidence that we should ignore this gastric residual volume. So I think in our Indian guidelines we have given, so this gastric residual volumes, you should not be connecting your nasogastric tube to continuous suction, rather they need to be syringed to check for gastric residual volume. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 2. So in Indian guidelines, we have taken 300 to 500 ml as a cutoff range, although the recent evidence does suggest that we should not pay attention to the quantity of the gastric residual volume. But still, I think logistically, I think it is reasonable to assess patients where gastric residual volumes are increasing to more than 400 to 500 ml. And when there is, obviously when your gastric residual volumes increase to more than this level, so we should not stop feed at any cost. I think that is what our current evidence suggests, that irrespective of what the gastric residual volume is, our attempts, relentless attempts should be to continue the gastric feeding. So your efforts should be to continue, but you may want to curtail the intake of the feeds or the volume of the feeds, but our efforts should be to continue. So if you are, say, feeding at 100 ml per hour, maybe you can drop down your volume to maybe 25 and then crank it up slowly to 50 ml per hour, but your efforts should continue. I think that is the norm. So that gets a level of recommendation is C. And to help you or facilitate ongoing tolerance of feeds, one could consider usage of metoclopramide plus or minus IV erythromycin to increase their feed intake. And if gastric residual volume is less than 500 ml, so there's absolutely no reason that you should be holding feeds, and in fact you should be continuing your enteral nutrition. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So I think this is about the gastric residual volume. So in essence, you wouldn't stop feeding irrespective of what your gastric residual volume is. If your gastric residual volume exceeds 500 ml, maybe you can cut down your feed volume, and you could use metoclopramide and erythromycin as an adjunct to facilitate nasogastric feeding. If it is less than 500 ml, there's absolutely no reason to stop enteral nutrition. What about diarrhea? I think this is also one of the reason people cite to stop feeds. So enteral nutrition should never be stopped or discontinued when there is an ongoing diarrhea. So it should be continued. And obviously you would take steps to curtail diarrhea by using soluble fiber. And if the diarrhea is refractory, you could consider semi-elemental nutrition in divided doses to facilitate feed tolerance and to deliver the appropriate nutrients that may be needed. But routine use of probiotics is not recommended. So as I said, I think the key essence of this whole talk is devise your own institutional protocol, have a protocol in place, and this protocol should be placed on the bedside, and every nurse should be educated about not stopping feeds when there is this gastric residual volume or gastric aspirates, or when there is diarrhea, and the way the feed has to be delivered. So that sensitization of the timing, the mode of delivery of the feed, the continuation of the feed, and emphasizing time and again not to interrupt the feeds. I think all this should happen in a protocolized way. So a protocol should be placed in every ICU and suiting their needs, and every nurse to be educated and sensitized on this. So the summary of my talk is enteral nutrition for all ICU patients should be started within 24 to 48 hours. It's a quality indicator. For any reason your ICU patient is not being fed, I think you have to reconcile that it is a breach in your quality indicator. And in patients who are hemodynamically unstable, I think your initial efforts is to hemodynamically stabilize them with fluid resuscitation and vasopressors. Once they have stabilized, please do start enteral nutrition within 24 to 48 hours. In patients who are hypercatabolic like burns, I think the suggested ratio of kilocalories is to nitrogen is 120 is to 1. So I think there is error in this picture. So if you are unable to achieve your target nutrition for up to 7 days, it has to be 7 days, then you could consider parenteral nutrition. And as you are feeding, concurrently your efforts is to assess for your gut function and your adequacy of the feed tolerance. So if you are unable to achieve your 50 to 60% of the targets within 72 hours with your oral feeding, tube feeding with and enteral nutrition should be considered. And there is no role for routine usage of combination of enteral nutrition plus parenteral nutrition. So it's not routinely recommended. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 2. And as I said, in COPD or type 2 respiratory failure, the concept of low carbohydrate and increased fat is a myth. It is no longer recommended. No longer recommended. Strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1, that we do not use low carbohydrate and increased fat in patients with type 2 respiratory failure. And what about role of immune modulating agents? We saw, so the routine usage of immune modulating agents like glutamine, arginine, or eicosapentaenoic acid, they're all not routinely recommended. That gets strong recommendation, level of evidence is 1. So thank you very much. So I would end my talk with this quote: everything in your life is a reflection of choice you have made. So make a right choice of right sort of a feeding composition and right timing of the feed and right delivery of the feed and right modifications that you would make. So if you want a different result, so you need to make a different choice. Thank you very much.